United States never put an astronaut on the moon. This conspiracy theory was started by a man named Bill Kaysing, who published a pamphlet in 1976, coyly titled, "We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle." The evidence provided to support this claim centers on many things, from an analysis of Neil Armstrong's boot print versus the waving American flag and the impossibility of this in windless space, and most pointedly to the ship itself. As Richard Godwin notes, writing about the moon landing hoax theory for The Guardian, quote, "If you have ever been to the Science Museum in London, you will know that the lunar module was basically made of tinfoil." This is a picture of it. Of the many points of evidence to prove that the moon landing was faked, the ship is a recurring theme. The argument is essentially that the machine which landed on the moon, of which NASA has lost all blueprints and specs, and this part is true, is a flimsy structure barely worthy of being a treehouse, let alone being an object capable of landing on the moon. And there's a lot of memes about this. This interrogation of the ship that landed on the moon suggests that our discourses of spatialization of the celestial elsewhere shapes our assumptions about what it takes to get out there and highlights that for most Western thinkers, only a very advanced machine is capable of taking us to the great universal beyond. But the belief that either we did land on the moon due to advanced machinery that even today we can't understand, sorry, one way to read the ship that landed on the moon, however, is to think, wow, we landed on the moon with foil. Or that we didn't land on the moon because foil could not possibly have anything to do with advanced machinery, as in, of course, we didn't use foil to land on the moon, still privileges a particular kind of materiality, and these different echelons of materiality speak to our worldview. In other words, the way we observe and talk about phenomenological strata is not simply a matter of witnessing a material fact. Rather, the way we construct materiality produces the phenomenal world. So what does it mean to center machinery when we talk about outer space and the celestial elsewhere? And what does it reveal about how we have come to engage what we call the physical world? Citing the historian of science, Lorraine Daston, Lisa Messeri notes that, quote, "In biographies of scientific objects, Daston outlines the realist and constructionist approaches to thinking about scientific objects. The realist situates an object as discoverable, as something always existing but not always known. The constructionist, in contrast, depicts objects as inventions, as things molded from a historical and local context. In other words, is a scientific object something that has meaning, that even exists outside the cultural and historical practices of scientists? A realist answers yes. A constructionist disagrees. Daston offers a middle road. Scientific objects are both real and historical. Pluto, for example, was discovered and acquired meaning in 1930, though it surely existed before Clyde Tombaugh's announcement. As a realist object, it has orbited the same path for millennia, but was only constructed as a planet until 2006. Scientists adjusted Pluto's ontological status, and in response, its epistemological utility shifted," end quote. The people who doubt that we landed on the moon because they find the ship unconvincing as a spacefaring object are submitting the historical record to a simultaneously realist and constructivist view, in that they are constructing a narrative based on what seems like common sense realism. In other words, they are questioning the ontology of the ship by suggesting that a few pieces of tin and foil do not have the beingness to navigate space. But what all of these perspectives miss about interrogations of previous space travel or aspirations of future space travel is that there are three objects operating in our episteme when we think about the celestial elsewhere. First, there is ourselves, the cosmonaut, which is a term I prefer to astronaut because it's a little more poetic. We humans who seek to take root among the stars, to cite Octavia Butler's adage from Parable of the Sower. Then there is the ship, without which we presume we have no hope whatsoever of making it to outer space. And then thirdly, there is the space itself, which, as Messeri shows above and in her book, Placing Outer Space and Earthly Ethnography of Other Worlds, is not simply a materialist reality, but is an epistemological construction. Each of these vectors, if you will, are interdependent, and one constructs the other. What we think about outer space reflects what we think about ourselves and about habitation and geography in general. What we think about the ships which could possibly take us to space reflect everything we know and think we know about the physical world, which returns us to habitation, which means that contemplations and engagement with outer space are, at their root, ecologically oriented. And furthermore, what we think about these seemingly physical sites, the ships, and the geography these ships are intended to navigate mirror our social, political, and relational dynamics in ways that not only shape the world, but that make the world. In 2021, after traveling to space for 11 minutes, Jeff Bezos declared at a press conference that, quote, "We need to take all heavy industry, all polluting industry, and move it into space, and keep Earth as this beautiful gem of a planet that it is," end quote. Outer space in current popular discourse, from films and televisual depictions into real-life initiatives such as those spearheaded by Bezos, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson, is the site of a range of narratives about the environment, about human evolution, and about exploration. One such narrative suggests that the Earth will soon be uninhabitable, and so we must find another planet to colonize. Here, Bezos reverses that formulation to suggest that we pollute space to preserve Earth's beauty and habitability. But this solution to our ecological problems suggests that space itself is not ecological and is separate from nature, that it is a barren wasteland. Also, this would not really work. So as this image here shows, space is already full of human trash, and this is posing a major problem for astronomers on Earth who can glean massive amounts of information about the galaxy and the wider universe through telescopes. Satellites are almost always silver. This reflects light in space, making it more difficult for telescopes to look out into space. Bezos' notion assumes that space is an elsewhere somehow separate from our environment, and so it's the trash dump of our capitalist dreams. My work here, however, undermines the tendency to view outer space as dead and empty by demonstrating that this category of thinking about the celestial elsewhere aligns with the Enlightenment split of man from nature articulated by Francis Bacon and others, who also theorized nature as inanimate and unalive in ways that ushered in the ethos of ecological destruction that has characterized Western society ever since. I suggest in this essay that the contemporary corporate space race is repetitionary of not only of the ideology of the West relative to the natural world, but that the consequences of such initiatives are likely to be destructive of the broader ecology, which in my formulation includes outer space in much the same way it has been on Earth. This fractured Enlightenment ecological illogic also structures our assumptions about what space travel is and how it can be accomplished. Generally, we assume that an encounter with these celestial elsewhere can only be achieved through the mechanical, technologies, rockets, propulsion engineering, and the like. In this essay, I consider the work of the British writer Tade Thompson in his novel Rosewater and Octavia Butler's Dawn, whose imagined encounters with the celestial elsewhere are rooted in an organic encounter with living beings. In both texts, the ships used by the aliens are alive, not mechanical vessels whose intended goal is to get us to outer space, and can only be understood as opposing life given the environmental devastation they entail, but are instead living beings themselves that symbiotically support life for itself/themselves, and for any beings that live or travel within its or their body. Both Thompson and Butler's conceptions of outer space rely upon an ethos that is antithetical to the machine-centered technological obsession of the West, which subverts its broader anti-nature orientation and suggests that even in the context of space exploration and/or contact, Earthlings must alter both their understanding and relationship to the natural world, which includes rather than excludes space itself. Thompson and Butler's narratives present a new ecology at the end of the world, where the result of apocalypse is a more aligned relationship to nature, where the future of the planet bends back upon itself via ecological return. We can think of both Thompson and Butler's work as, Matthew Omelsky puts it, as, quote, post-crisis fiction, whose settings and plots are structured by life after the dual crisis of ecology and capital, end quote. In both texts, a certain otherworldliness is required to achieve ecological harmony, since, as Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin show, quote, capitalist modernity inaugurates the Anthropocene and its looming global catastrophe, end quote. One implication of all of these contemplations, from Bezos to Butler, is that what we want from the future is what we had in the past, a viable ecological world. And yet, as Gayatri Spivak notes in another context, we can never return to our origins. The marriage of futurity and ecology finds a home in speculative fiction, where, in the case of this essay, Thompson and Butler think beyond the event horizon of the machine. I would like to suggest that the creation of the machine always already indicates insufficiency. It is, I argue, the sign not of progress, but of failure. Because like the necropolitical context from which it arises, machine logic refuses a limit, since unlike organic life, machines do not require relationality, nor are they mortal. If the twin crisis of racial capitalism is relationality and mortality, then the machine seems to solve these problems without requiring us to figure out why they have become problems in the first place. Put another way, if the problem of the slave, the laborer, and the worker is that no relation of power can ever be egalitarian, and that the organic body knows a limit, which is death, then the machine requires neither empathy or water. It can be worked, abused, disregarded, and thus enables the preservation of metaphysical humanism, which is to say, it ensures the continuance of the Enlightenment human who believes that nature is a slave to be broken on the rack, which is a quote from Francis Bacon, and that will to power represents the evolution of consciousness as opposed to the opposite. And I'm sure you can hear that there are a lot of implications in this work around AI, but I'm not going to get into AI in this talk. The machine is what Plato might call a pharmacon, which is what Achille Mbembe notes in Necropolitics can be understood both as a remedy and a poison. For the purposes of domination at any cost, the machine is a revelation. But for the purpose of life not inflected by pervasive necropolitical inflections, the machine is more poison than remedy. Furthermore, the machine is a thing, and to engage the object in the post-Black Atlantic world is always already to speak towards and around Blackness, since, as Fred Moten notes in Resistance of the Object Aunt Hester Scream, quote, the history of Blackness is testament to the fact that objects can and do resist, end quote. Thus, the notion of the machine is merely a mechanism whereby we can imagine that upon the inanimate we could safely project our tendencies towards objectification and met out abuses without consequence. What I'm saying here is easily grasped if you imagine an argument between two people that culminates in one of them punching through a wall. The wall cannot file charges, but the impulse of violence is felt nevertheless in ways that in no way soften the blow. Saying it was just a wall will not erase the damage, since at that moment the wall and the other person are one and the same as recipients of the puncher's rage. In other words, the machine itself is encircled by a fiction of objectification, and what we think of as dead and in a state of perpetual stasis has a life cycle of youthful robustness and eventual decay. Spaceships explode when pushed past their limits. Machines have life too, even as we attempt to make things otherwise through a binary discourse of animate and inanimate, an opposition whose only true purpose is to maintain the world as a place of dialectical tension. Faith or lack thereof in the machine of the West correlates to the degree of confidence we feel about the American project. And the conspiracy theories about the moon landing speak less about our spacefaring than they do to an ontological crisis precipitated by the emergence of Black, queer, trans, and woman-centered power. In other words, the white, cis, heterosexual man can no longer show up unproblematically as Nietzsche's Übermensch, so now the faceless denizens of internet conspiracists are obsessed with foil. If the discursive machine, not to be confused with machines themselves, stands in for white cis masculinity in the West's own rendering of itself. And I do not mean to imply that others do not have the aptitude or impulse for the creation of such machines, but rather that the way the machine is theorized in this space is what differs. Then the stakes of the machine, the ship as an ontological being, become clearer. So the representation of a living ship in Octavia Butler's Dawn is more than just a cool sci-fi plot twist. The living ship itself stands in for another kind of ontological cosmology. It, as Calvin Warren enjoins us to do, imagines existence anew. So the main character of Octavia Butler's novel is named Lilith, and a quick summary of the novel is that humans have destroyed Earth with nuclear war, and these aliens that Butler calls the Oankali are sort of going through space. They see what's happening. They swoop in, they gather up a bunch of humans and bring them into the ship and put them in stasis, and then they sort of like heal them. And then they wake up one human, Lilith, and they give Lilith the responsibility of waking up all the other humans and telling them what the deal is. So, when Lilith wakes up inside the Oankali vessel, she cannot understand what sort of space she's in. She can recognize it as a kind of cell, as a place she is being held, but it has no doors and no furniture. There is only a raised platform where she sleeps. Everything she is given to eat is edible, including the bowl, and any waste she produces is absorbed by the cell itself. In other words, it is a physical space where there is no separation. Quote, she rubbed the scar, tracing its outline. Finally, she sat on the bed and ate her bland meal, finishing the bowl as well, more for a change of texture than to satisfy any residual hunger. Then she began the oldest and most futile of her activities, a search for some crack, some sound of hollowness, some indication of a way out of her prison. End quote. A human-made structure constructed out of a discourse, a human-made structure constructed from a discourse of the inanimate would have a variation, which would indicate the crack or the break that she is looking for. A break would enable Lilith to find a way out. An organic living being, like the Oankali ship, is on the other hand much freer of these sorts of vulnerability because it is a living, sentient, and intelligent being that can anticipate her needs and her impulse for escape. Butler's narrative brilliantly invites us to notice how much notions of separation, of difference, and structure produce the phenomenological world. Consider, for example, that when one is in an airplane, one knows without a doubt that this ship is not me and not like me. This separation can be further elaborated. The chair-like seat on the plane is part of the plane, but not the plane itself. Likewise, with the floor, the lights, and even the individual components of engine and turbine that make the airplane fly. We have been taught that this is not a constructed relationship to the objective world. In other words, we think of our entire cosmology around the animate and inanimate world as a fact. Butler's text, on the other hand, invites us to consider what would shift and change about our society if we went the other direction and perceived everything, even what we consider to be inanimate, to have life. The Oankali ship is a holistic system where everything is one, and in fact, the Oankali refer to the ship as one of their relatives because it represents a life form that arose at an earlier moment in their history. And they're actually genetically tied to it. Eventually, once Lilith can be trusted to move freely through Oankali society, she is taught how to open a door simply by touching the ship, which responds to her organically, one living being to another. In a pivotal scene, when Lilith is finally able to be outside of her room, she plants an orange peel in the ground, which is what she does in her room, only to watch in horror as the area becomes sick. Quote, she got up, moved away from the pseudo tree she had been leaning against, and scratched a shallow hole in the soil. It was actually soil, Nikanj had told her. She buried her orange peelings, knowing they would be gone within a day, broken down by the tendrils of the ship's own living matter. Or that was what was supposed to happen. As she took out her extra jacket and brushed herself off, the ground around the buried peelings began to darken. The color change recaptured her attention, and she watched as the soil slowly became mud, and turned the same orange that the peelings had been. This was an effect she had never seen before. End quote. When Cayuga comes upon the scene, the Uloi comments, and by the way, in Oankali society, there are males, females, and Uloi, who are a non-gendered third kind of category in their society. The Uloi comments, quote, "So you finally found something to poison," end quote, speaking to the Oankali's perception of humanity's destructive tendencies towards all things living. Lilith is told that she can't bury trash there and learns an important lesson about the living being that is the ship that she occupies. This arrangement of living being to living being radically challenges the hierarchy of power endemic in our society. The machine, the ship, is reduced to an inanimate tool over which the human has primacy. But in Oankali culture, everything is alive, and the order of society is dictated by an ethos of survivance, proliferation of life, which is the opposite of a necropolitics. The living ship requires something different from Lilith. She must revise her relationship to the external world through her habitation of the living ship. The living ship also collapses the boundary between man and nature, between human and ecology, highlighting that everything is ultimately ecological in either origin or iteration. Tade Thompson's novel Rosewater engages the notion of a living organic ship in much the way Jordan Peele's film Nope does. The alien entity is an animal with no riders, a being where the separation between cosmonaut and ship is even further collapsed. Jean Jacket in Peele's film is at once conveyance and being, which, despite the alienating quality of its physical abilities, is identical to what we are as creatures, both alive and capable of moving ourselves from one place to another within a certain geographical plane, without the help of another entity, either, say, a horse or an object or a motorcycle. As a side note, I'll say that in my book, I spend a lot of time talking about locomotion and questions of it relative to ontology, which are at the center of Peele's film. And I argue that this is a kind of thought experiment about layers of alienation relative to the interplay between the layers of the earth environment and the ground and the air. Unlike Nope, however, which maintains the human-alien divide, Rosewater, like Dawn, merges human and alien through something called the xenosphere. And I think it's kind of interesting that the series of books that I'm talking about from Butler are referred to as the Xenogenesis series, and then Thompson picks up that language in Rosewater with this notion of the xenosphere. While the Oankali are explicit about the fact that they are genetic traders, a species of self-professed ethical sluts traversing the universe looking for what they consider to be genomic goodies like cancer. And so, just as a side note, the Oankali are able to take human cancer cells and use them to regrow limbs and heal people from other injuries. The alien dome in Rosewater, Nigeria, where the novel is set, operates more like a fungus, releasing spores that eventually begin to alter and change the humans who live near the dome. Humans living near the dome develop special psychic abilities, and once a year, the dome opens and heals people of whatever diseases and injuries they may have. And I'll just say this does not always go the way the humans want it to. Revelation is withheld in Rosewater about the nature of the alien creature, which upsets the geopolitical realities of Earth. England, the site where the dome first emerges, bombs the alien creature, and then it migrates to Nigeria, where it is allowed to live and thus radically transforms society. I'm just going to let the PowerPoint do what it wants, but that quote is coming. In addition to operating as a mechanism whereby people can more deeply connect in a telepathic way, the alien dome also provides power to the town of Rosewater, solving one of our most persistent human issues. Thompson's Rosewater and the subsequent novels in the trilogy drive home the ontological implications of the alien structure where Cairo, the main character, says, quote, "I am not the same. I don't look at utopicity in the same way. It's not a sty or a boil swollen with purulence, waiting, biding its time. I don't know what my healing has cost me. How many native cells have the xenoforms driven out? 10, 15%? How human am I?" End quote. The characters in Rosewater, and specifically Cairo, are in the process of becoming other kinds of humans. They are what could happen if we were able to imagine existence anew. Unlike the evolutionary teleology of, say, the film The Matrix, which, don't get me wrong, I love The Matrix, Thompson's novel doesn't blithely presuppose that a different existence. Now, see, that I don't want you to see right now. Thompson's novel doesn't blithely presuppose that a different existence will be a better one in every way. In the world of Rosewater, some things are better, some things are worse, and some things are the same. This salvifically pragmatic political approach undoes the tendency of the Western progress narrative, which always presumes that true utopia is just one Mars colony away. Okay. If the comments on various TikToks are any indication, there are large swaths of the population that hope that aliens will save us from ourselves. One comment you can almost always find on posts that assert the existence of aliens are pleas for release from the traumas of capitalism. Discourses about aliens and outer space speak to our deep desire for escape from the various systems which oppress us. In other words, otherworldly fantasies are actually metonyms for abolition. Were we to embrace this cosmology of interrelation and living connection, how might it change the way we show up as beings? Perhaps it is the optimist in me that speculates that cultures built upon the notion of inextricable interconnection would produce a different and more life-affirming set of connections. Perhaps we would see each other the way we see the parts of our own bodies. My finger might get a rash and itch and irritate me, but I am unlikely to cut it off because though it is annoying me in the moment, I recognize its importance to my overall being. I think that the representation of a living ship in these two texts bends towards what Fred Moten notes as Saidiya Hartman calls the dramatic interenactment of contentment and abjection, as discourses of rememberment and redress that we always hear in narratives where Blackness simultaneously marks both the performance of the object and the performance of humanity. This dramatic ontological tension characterizes these texts which attempt to think beyond the discourse of the machine as inanimate in order to thematize abolition through the language of the speculative, which is the only place abolition can currently be found. It bears pointing out that there are historical examples of the sort of cosmology of which I speak. Some argue that it characterized human society before the dawn of agriculture. But whether we speculate forward into time or backwards, we remain in speculative relation to an alternate set of ontological arrangements, which I argue here undergird our desires for the living ship as expressed in these texts. But what is the difference between a living ship and the Earth itself? This question is implicit in the Oankali repair of Earth, which the humans destroy with nuclear war. Taking a leftover chunk of Earth and converting it into a ship, Dawn is low-key asking us what difference there is between the Earth, a living mass that is moving through space, and yes, we are moving, not just around the sun, but through the entire galaxy, that contains everything we need to survive. Dawn engages Buckminster Fuller's idea from the book Operating Manual for the Spaceship Earth, where he asserted that, quote, I am a passenger on the spaceship Earth, in which he argued that, end quote, in which he argued that we see Earth as an integrated system rather than as a disaggregated collection of sites. In other words, if we adopt Fuller's view, we are already on the Oankali ship right now. Standing on the ground, we are on the observation deck of the entire universe. The Earth's rotation enables us to get, over a 24-hour period, a full view of whatever our eyes or telescopes can bring into view. And like any other ship we might create, we are largely confined to the ship itself, given that our bodies are not equipped to deal with the ecology of outer space. Perhaps we are the ships we have been looking for. Who is to say that the bacteria in your intestines are not intentional beings hitching a ride through the universe inside your stomach? And perhaps we are simply bacteria on the surface of Earth's skin along for the ride, all while mistakenly thinking we are driving the ship. What can we say about this picture of Mars? Or this one? Well, what we can say is that neither of these is Mars at all. The first one is the Badlands National Park in South Dakota, and the second one is the Red Desert of Wyoming. I played this trick to undermine our notion that our cartographies are stable, and that when we experience space, either in person or in our imagination or through images caught by Mars's space rover, that what we are experiencing is something other than ourselves. We have a discourse about Mars as the red planet, as barren, as in need of terraforming, but we have almost identical spaces right here on Earth. What if, as a response to the catastrophes of climate change, we terraformed Terra? In other words, what would it mean to recognize that we are already where we need to go and already doing what we dream about, moving through space on a navigational living ship that travels through the galaxy at 67,000 miles per hour, having a celestial experience? Our Earth might be understood as one component of a larger ship, powered at its core by the sun, which is constantly moving through space, orbiting the center of the Milky Way, taking our entire solar system with it at an average speed of 450,000 miles per hour. And the galaxy itself is also moving at the rate of 1.3 million miles per hour. In fact, nothing in the entire universe is stationary. Everything is in motion on a scale that is unimaginable to us. In this context, what is the ship? What is space? And what is travel? Under this interrogation, the notion of space travel itself collapses entirely in the face of the recognition that we are always already shipbound on a galactic journey through space and time. There is nowhere to go because we are already here. Thank you.
That was that was beautiful. Thank you so much. We are able to take questions from the audience. I have a microphone, and Anna does on the other side. So we invite your thoughts, questions, or comments.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Natalia Guerrero. Hi, I'm a graduate student in the astronomy department. Um, so going back to your original example of the lunar lander, in your framework, how would you describe it in response to the skeptical framework?
What do you mean? Do I think we actually went to the moon? Is that
More
which?
like I'm still sort of stuck on like the skepticism of the machine
Yeah.
and like how how do you like jump from that to like looking at like the living machine?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think we went to the moon. I enjoy the conspiracy theories because I think that they tell us something about like where we are in relation to these kind of what at one time was a national initiative and is now a more of a corporate initiative. I wrote this, I've been working on this for a long time, so I had no idea that Elon Musk and Mars and space travel were going to be so front and center in our national conversations at this time. And I was at a conference, I swear I'm answering your question. I was at a conference and I met an astronaut there, and this former astronaut, Janet Cavendish, works with like Blue Origin, and there were some other people there who were working with Elon Musk with SpaceX. And I asked the question about like, okay, what would it take to make a ship that was actually alive? Because I'm not a scientist, I'm a literary critic, and I work on speculative fiction, so I have a wild imagination about what might be possible. Um, for me, I think I actually believe that if we ever are going to get off the Earth ship, if we ever are going to be able to travel in space, I think that Octavia Butler predicted, I think these speculative, authors are actually predicting what it will take to do so. Because if you think about the genre of space travel films and actually just space travel itself, I mean, as we speak, there are two astronauts who they cannot get out of space, right? Like they're stuck. They've been stuck for quite a while. Um, the central like conflict around space travel is basically that we are trying to take ourselves as organic extensions of Earth, which is what we are, and put ourselves kind of in a can and hope that like that can sustain life. And this is like a fundamental misunderstanding of like what we are as beings. So for example, you would never take like, I don't know, a little sapling of a tree and put it in a can and shoot it into outer space and expect it to live, because we understand that trees need soil, they need oxygen, like they need the earth environment to live. We also need the earth environment to live, which is why space travel doesn't work, which is why I think many of these really brilliant writers have moved towards imagining space travel and encounters with space through an organic entity as opposed to through an inanimate object. So that's kind of, you know, a history of how I ended up having these thoughts about a living ship. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. So would you agree that the skepticism about the lunar landing, is that coming from maybe like this intrinsic or like subconscious desire for a living or more organic way to do space travel?
No. I think the conspiracy theories about the lunar landing have to do with a general distrust of the government that has evolved over a period of time, in a sense that like we're always kind of being lied to and there's always like some other agenda. So I think that's where a lot of the skepticism about the moon landing comes from. Um, I also think it's sort of related to undermining, I mean, and you know, I hesitate to say this, because, you know, I'm not in favor of going into space with machines, but I also think you know, the conspiracy theory is ideologically in the service of undermining, you know, innovation, undermining the notion that we could have innovated that much. So
That's really helpful. Thank you.
you're welcome.
Thank you for your presentation. I loved it. I got a little lost at the beginning, but one thing I wanted to say, I've not read these books, but your descriptive and intense language just brought up so many visuals, and I'm very excited to dive into those books, and maybe one day there'll be a mini series. I don't know. I mean, it was very compelling, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I do think that I think there's a good chance at least that Dawn will end up being a mini series at some point.
I have a question right here.
Hi, my name is Ellie. I'm a PhD in the Department of Art History, and I am very interested in ecology, so this talk was thrilling for me. Since you work in both fiction and nonfiction, with your ideas of futurity and looking forward, and also the ecological crisis that we are in, can futurity find a place in academic writing? Do we always need to look back? How do you grapple with this?
Well, you know, I don't think the future exists. So, so all of our, I mean, and this is also true, like in the context of, I mean, literally the future, of course, doesn't exist, right? Like you're always in a perpetual now. So whenever we say the future, we're actually invoking a discourse, and discourses have histories. So, so when someone is sort of talking about the future, they are engaging a very specific historical discourse, because you can't articulate something that like doesn't exist, right? Like, I don't know, if you could go back 150 years and say and try to tell someone what a cell phone is, it probably wouldn't work. I mean, maybe if they had, maybe if you, it would have to be like pre-telegram even, right? You know, how would you describe a cell phone to someone whose only mode of long distance communication was um the letter? And so, and if you went further back in time, you know, before the printing press was created, it would be hard to describe like a book to someone, I think. I mean, you could, but I mean, you would struggle to find articulation for these things that exist now that if you could go back in time, um, would not exist. And there wouldn't be a mechanism or like even a conception for you to have in language to describe to the other person what it was you were talking about. So to me, futurity is always a fantasy. And that fantasy can tell us more about what's happening now than what could potentially happen in the future. Does that make sense? I can't hear anything. If you're
Sorry,
speaking.
we're just walking.
Okay.
Hi. First of all, oh, my name's Jayla. I wanted to say I absolutely loved this lecture. And it had me actually really thinking about like the ship of Theseus, um, that whole thought experiment. And so would you say that examining the ship of Theseus as a thought experiment that highlights our interconnectedness rather than the parts that make us unique is necessary for understanding that we aren't as separate from our environment that we may think?
Yes. I think that the notion of separation in the, I argue in my book Black to Nature basically that the thing that that sort of like predicts or sets the Western world up for a really intrinsic and intractable like anti-Blackness from which many other kinds of like anti-ideologies arise. Like the thing that sets us up for that first is the herniation in Western philosophy between humans and nature. So like in Western philosophy, you don't come out of the world, you come into the world, right? It's like, I, a stranger and afraid in a world I never made, right? There's that famous poem. So this is like, so we feel as if we're like, we're like in this place, but we're not of this place. But actually we are of this place. We are like apples on an apple tree. And we are reliant upon this environment to exist. And that's also the other way in which I was sort of thinking how I ended up with this idea of the living ship, to just go back to the first person's comment. If we could, if we could philosophically hold the space in our mind of lack of separation and deep interconnection with all things, like everything that we experience in the phenomenological world, then yes, I think it would have dramatically different outcomes for the way our societies operate and the experiences that we have.
Thank you.
I have another question here, and then we'll get back to that side.
Don't you think that indulgent in futuristic books and things like this have created an illusion that people can practically live in outer space, and this is totally impossible. There's a great book recently came out called The End of Astronauts. I don't know whether you've read that. It just came out last year, and it's just foolish. The idea that people can, but literature over the last decades has glorified the idea that, gee whiz, we can have a wonderful time in outer space, and this is a total illusion.
I completely agree with you. Not only do I think it is not feasible for us to be in outer space, I also think it's completely unnecessary. So, even if it somehow did become possible for us to like go to Mars, I mean, why go to Mars? I mean, as I say in another chapter of my book, there's a really good book you would probably like. It's more pulp fiction than, high literature, but it's called Do You Dream of Terra 2? As in, it's a double entendre on TOO and TWO. And it's by a British Nigerian writer named Temi O. And in the text, basically, it's like they're going, the humans are going to outer space, but the central thesis of the book basically is that it doesn't really matter where you go. Like, what's going to happen? We're going to build Walmarts on Mars. Like, why would you, like, what is the reason that we would actually need to be on another planet? Because what we are likely to do when we get to that other planet is not become completely different beings and live in a completely different way, but rather to simply repeat the forms of society and relations and access to goods and all of those things that we have here on Earth. So I agree with you. I don't think that there's anything problematic about people fantasizing about going to outer space, but I think that these fantasies about outer space are actually deep desires for, like, in when the fantasy of the space travel is a little bit more egalitarian and utopic, like for example in a text like Star Trek. It's not a complete utopia, but things are pretty, they're much more utopic than our societies, on the Enterprise. There's a lot more kind of understanding and higher thinking, and there's no capitalist pressure and those sorts of things. I think these fantasies about outer space actually represent like deep desires that we have in our lives here on Earth. And understood that way, I'm all in favor of people having whatever kinds of imaginative space tripping that they would like to have. But I agree with you, going to outer space is completely impractical and also unnecessary. And it would destroy the Earth, by the way. That's the other thing. It's an ecological nightmare for Earth.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
Great talk. My name's Flounder. I've read both the series that you're talking about. They're great. I also like Benti, Nedia Corfor's Benti is also another living ship in this. But I like how they all share this hybridization for people to go to space, because I actually do want to go to space and think we should. That's a different, we disagree on that part. But and there's a great artist, Oscar Santillan, who is thinking about putting like hybridizing people to be able to go to space by changing their DNA instead of like aliens coming and changing our DNA. We do it purposefully and things like this. And it's like through this is sort of thinking about the pre-decolonization of space, because I agree with you. The way it is currently going, yeah, we're gonna have Walmarts and there's gonna be an Amazon warehouse, same day delivery on Mars, or something. So, but have you thought about like the hybridity or the pre-decolonization or anything along those lines?
So you mean, what's the decolonial part?
Oh, just not repeating the way
Oh,
that colonization currently happened, and then capitalism sort of taken over from that and continuing the all the negatives
yeah,
of that. How can
yeah.
we do any of this without that? Is it possible even?
Well, I think if we actually kind of, deeply internalized like decolonial epistemologies and like transformed our human consciousness, we wouldn't want to go to outer space. I think that like, and I mean, a part of like what brings me to this project is like my own obsession with space. Like, I don't want to go to space, but I have like a really great telescope, and I go places just to see like the northern lights, and like I love astronomy. Like, I'm really into sort of looking out into the celestial elsewhere. But I think that, sort of needing to geographically put oneself in what we think of as this like other space would probably be very much destabilized by a shift in consciousness. And if we really shifted our consciousness and we were no longer like quite human anymore, meaning metaphysical humanism, I'm not talking about like our bodies look different or something, but like our whole notion of our ontology like radically shifted, then I think Earth would radically shift, right? Like the fantasies that we have about these other worlds and what they might look um, like our perception of the ecology of Earth would really shift. Like if you go to, some of the national parks in this country, like there are some landscapes like Wind Cave National Park, for example, that it literally does look like a Dr. Seuss drawn, fairy tale. It's got these round, puffy, pink, plants that you don't commonly see, and it's got a field of prairie dogs, and as you walk, they kind of pop up and look at you, then they pop down, you know. So there are all of these like sort of otherworldly sites that already exist here, which is kind of why I showed the pictures of the Badlands and the Red Desert. to sort of say that, you know, the kind of longing for those spaces is present. Like those kinds of spaces are already present, but a shift in our own consciousness will also turn Earth into a different planet. It would be a different planet if we were different, if we were showing up different as beings, differently as beings.
Thank you.
We have 3 more people who have raised their hands. If you have the energy for that, you've been really generous with your Q&A, but we would love to just take 3 more. So the gentleman here with the orange hat, yes? Am I right?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I haven't read a ton of Afrofuturism literature. This is kind of like the ultimate, it's kind of the closing out event of Afrofuturism week here at UF. I'm a grad student, study business and art and design. I've been locked in. I dropped out of school a while back and kind of fixated on a bunch of different ideas and ideated for a long time, did some soul searching, and I got locked in on this idea of vitalism. And I'm just curious how vitalism plays into maybe your narrative and Afrofuturism, and also maybe how it plays into like the chief archetypes that exist. I just took a Latin American creative narratives class with the Center for Latin American Studies and wrote like a 50 or 60 page thing of compilation of short, simple narratives, right? And I'm curious about the archetypes you've used, from like the warrior to the scientist to the storyteller, right? Um, Maybe how does vitalism play into like these archetypes? Like why 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 is the ship able to be living, right? I don't understand. Like I maybe I didn't grasp the narrative completely, and I thought I did, but I didn't. But it was a lot to digest for someone who hasn't read the text. But I'm just curious why how vitalism plays into some of those chief archetypes, right? Thank you.
What is vitalism?
So vitalism is the idea that basically humans are fundamentally different from machines, and they have this spiritual aspect that separates them from machines. I is there yeah, I'm curious how vital, maybe what role does vitalism play in Afrofuturism, right?
Okay.
I
I
thought I
don't,
had a more
yeah.
robust question for you, but I'm sorry, I don't know if I did.
No, it's fine. I don't actually know. I mean, I can't answer a question about vitalism, because I haven't thought about it and didn't know what don't know what it is still.
Okay.
But but I can say that the way the ship is living is that these are fictions and fiction writers can do whatever they want. So they made the ship living. In Butler's text, this particular group of aliens are gene traders, and so they would take genes from different beings they encounter throughout the various universes they traverse, and they would use them to achieve certain kinds of aims, right? So, like, an Owen Collie perspective on the ship would be like, if we could sequence the DNA of like a centipede and put it on a spaceship, and then it could, like, you know, go through space, you know, like this, and it would be alive. And we could also sequence our DNA with it, so we could actually like telepathically send thoughts to it in our languages that it would understand. Then you would have this sentient ship that could kind of move you through space, right? I mean, this is entirely fictional. Um, I mean, when I did meet Janet Cavendish, I did ask about the possibility of a living ship being created. Um, and I also asked the other person who works for SpaceX, but I can't remember their name now. Um, and, you know, both of them were like, ha, we are so far from being able to do such a thing. And then, of course, you know, I'm persistent. So I followed up and I was like, okay, what about a hybrid? What about a hybrid ship, like a metal ship where you have like hydroponic roots of a tree that grow, like there's, you could have the outer layer of the ship You could have the inner layer of the ship, and you could have a gap between the two, like a big gap, and then roots could kind of grow around that, and you could have the foliage of the plant grow inside the ship, and then the roots would provide a little extra support for the structure of the ship, and also produce oxygen within the ship, and also perhaps like grow food inside the ship and start to create a moving ecology. And they also said that's not happening. So I mean, I think that it is possible that some like truly brilliant person one day will figure out how to do it. But probably we need to make a car out of a tree first. Once we do that, once we have once your car is actually a living being, and isn't a mechanical thing, then we could probably like make the leap to figuring out how to make a living ship. So that's the link between the ship, the how the ship becomes alive in these narratives. To your question about the archetypes, I think the archetypes matter less because all of these like divisions are sort of broken down. So in Rosewater, for example, when Cairo is in the xenosphere, he's able to actually inhabit the consciousness of non-human beings. And some of them are and other people can too. And some of them are sort of spiritual beings, and some of them are kind of like part butterfly and part human. And there are all these, sort of playful and sort of improvisational possibilities for being which occur, which I think is sort of anti-archetype, if you will. It sort of breaks down these archetypes in certain kinds of ways.
Great. We have one last question. The question has been withdrawn. Please join me in thanking Dr. That's why we do these things virtually. Thanking Dr. Dunning for a really remarkable lecture and Q&A.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed all of your questions. And now I'm going to go read about vitalism. Thank you for that question.
Thank you for being with us this evening, and please enjoy the rest of the Afrofuturism event here at the museum. Ciao.
Bye.
Where are we? So that was really wonderful.
Hello.
Hello.
Sharing it.
Yeah, that was awesome.
I have a lot more
Thank
reading
you.
to do now. I've expanded my reading list enormously.
Yeah.
I have reading to do too. A couple of texts mentioned that I'm excited to dig into. Thank you all so much for allowing me to do this virtually, because my crazy schedule here. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed meeting you and giving the lecture and all the questions. So thank you so much.
Nah, yeah. Yeah, it was a pleasure. So I'll probably follow up in an email, but like, yeah, have a good night.
Okay.